Good afternoon. Welcome to this long overdue, much promised revision lesson on the Nazi police state. So, this was an area that many people struggled in the mock exam back in December. Many of you talked a lot about propaganda and indoctrination in schools, but when we use the term police state, we are of course talking about the apparatus of terror that was created by Heinrich Himmler as the head of the SS. So we're talking about the SS, we're talking about the Gestapo, we're talking about the concentration camps, we're talking about the control of the courts. Propaganda was another mechanism the regime used to control the German population, to secure support or acquiescence with the regime. Terror was the other. So that is often the debate. What was more effective? Was it the terror? In other words, was it the work of Himmler, the Gestapo, the SS, the concentration camps, or was it more about the seduction that occurred through the propaganda? So we'll look at both. This lesson is all about the Nazi police state. The other lesson that I will record shortly will be all about Nazi propaganda, so that moving forward we can distinguish more accurately between the two. Now, let's just start with the basics. So when we talk about the police state, as I've mentioned previously, we're talking really about how the Nazis terrorized and coerced the German population into submission. So we have to remember that all of this was done legally. And it was done legally because the old Weimar Constitution had been suspended in the wake of the Reichstag fire. So in the days following the Reichstag fire, if you recall, Hitler had persuaded Hindenburg to invoke Article 48 and to curtail very important sections of the old German Constitution. So sections 114, 115, 117, 118, 123, 153, amongst others, were suspended until further notice. So this allowed the regime to impose restrictions on personal freedoms, on the right of the individual to express himself freely, so freedom of opinion. It also curtailed the freedom of the media to report honestly on the regime. It curtailed the right to assemble peacefully. So all the type of things that we would associate with a democratic government were swept to one side as a result of the protection law that was rolled out in the wake of the Reichstag fire. So effectively, that provided the legal basis that the Nazis needed to pursue a policy of terror and to create a police state. And of course, it was those powers, that apparatus of terror, that Hitler was able to unleash during the Night of the Long Knives. So the photo montage you can see there is a photo montage by a communist artist called John Hartfield. We've seen some of his photo montages before. He was a big critic of the regime at the time. He was working in Czechoslovakia, of course, before the German invasion, and he produced many photo montages which were critical of the Nazi regime. So, bear in mind, this is a long time before Photoshop, so it really was a skilled piece of art and photography. And he's commenting there, of course, on the Blood Purge, or the Night of the Long Knives of 1934. So what the Night of the Long Knives demonstrated, as we've seen, is that Hitler could quite literally get away with murder. This was the first time Hitler had unleashed the SS, the Gestapo. He did it, as we know, to eliminate the SA, which had been one of the older instruments of Nazi terror. And what the Night of the Long Knives showed was that Hitler could use terror, use violence to eliminate his opponents. So that kind of set the trend for what was to come in the Nazi regime. So when we talk about the police state, the one person you have to know all about is Heinrich Himmler, who was the leader of the SS, the Gestapo, state security, as they became. He became one of Hitler's inner circle, and towards the end of the Second World War, arguably heir apparent to Hitler himself. He became one of the most powerful members of Hitler's inner circle. So the whole instrument of terror was centered around Heinrich Himmler. And in 1936, he was appointed the chief of police. And so that gave him authority over, for example, the Kripo, the conventional, ordinary German police, which was effectively assimilated into the SS network. It gave him overall control of the Gestapo, the secret police. It gave him control over the labor camps or concentration camps where political prisoners were sent. Now, the SS also had its own security service, the SD, and its brief was very, very similar to that of the Gestapo. So there was, perhaps a little bit of rivalry between the two organizations. It was responsible for state security. It was responsible for making sure that members of the Nazi Party were toeing the line. All right, so the SS, this whole became this sort of octopus, and its influence was felt everywhere, even amongst loyal members of the Nazi Party who had to watch what they were saying, because there was a high probability they were under some form of surveillance by the SD. Okay. So again, the SD and the Gestapo, these organizations could arrest anyone for any reason. They had the power to intercept mail, to search homes. So there was a bit of duplicity there, and often historians do argue that there was real chaos in the Nazi government, where you see these organizations effectively with the same brief, doing the same job, all competing with each other. Now, the Gestapo, another part of the SS after 1936, of course, this was the secret police. So they didn't wear uniforms. They spied on those citizens who they believed were a threat to the regime. They would tap telephone conversations. They would intercept mail. Again, they had the power to arrest anyone on suspicion of a political crime. They had the power to imprison that individual indefinitely, to use torture and other methods to extract information from the suspect. Now, crucially, the Gestapo, their power came in setting up a network of civilian informants. That was their real power. And that's what made people very cagey about criticizing the regime, because you might be overheard by a Gestapo informant. The person that you're talking to, even if it's your best friend, might be on the payroll of the Gestapo. And so this was a very effective way of ensuring obedience and conformity. It created suspicion and mistrust. Even parents would have to be careful about criticizing the regime in front of their children. Now, as part of the indoctrination that was going on in schools, how children were being educated to embrace Nazi beliefs, what they were being taught, and in the organizations like the Hitler Youth or the League of German Maidens, the children tended to be very enthusiastic about the regime, and they were encouraged to snitch on their parents if their parents were being critical of the regime. Teachers who were, not teaching the new Nazi curriculum could probably expect at some point to be visited by the Gestapo. So the Gestapo's power really came from a network of civilian informers. And so effectively what they did was to get the people to police each other. Now, the labour camps, of course, so that is a picture of one of the first labour camps or concentration camps set up at Dachau, and various other followed. Now, what we must distinguish here is the difference between a labour camp or a concentration camp as opposed to a death camp. Now, of course, the death camps were not set up until the Second World War. Most of them were set up in the occupied territories in places like Poland. The death camps were places, of course, that were set up to execute people, particularly political prisoners and obviously Jewish people and other kind of races that the Nazis deemed to be undesirable. They were designed to effectively kill people on an industrial basis. We're not talking about that at the moment. We're talking about life in Nazi Germany in the 1930s. So the labour camps were effectively set up for political prisoners. Okay, people who had committed a crime against the Nazi Party would be sent, oftentimes for a period of 4 years, sometimes longer, to do hard labour. It was the SS, the death head units that would police the concentration camps. And yes, there were some re-executions. People were shot. Disease spread rapidly through these concentration camps. And oftentimes, people collapsed or were worked to death. So they were very, very horrible places, but they were not kind of geared towards the industrial slaughter that we see in the Second World War. So it's important to be able to distinguish between a concentration camp and a death camp. The death camps came later in the 1940s in the Second World War. Now, these were not secret, and there's a reason for that. The concentration camps were well known, and it was there as a deterrent. Okay, people knew that if they spoke out of turn and that they could well be, informed upon by a Gestapo informant, and that would, inevitably result in arbitrary arrest, no trial, and internment in a concentration camp. So the people knew all too well about the existence of these camps, and that was on purpose. They were there as a deterrent, as a key feature of the Nazi police state. Now, the courts were also very, very important. They were a very important part of the Nazi police state. The Nazis set up what was called a People's Court. And this was a special court that the Nazis set up to try people accused of political offences or political crimes. Oftentimes they were overseen by a notorious Nazi judge called Roland Freisler. And that's his picture there in the top left-hand corner. He was a fanatical Nazi, a fanatical supporter of Hitler. The trials that took place were what we call a show trial. And that means the trial isn't fair, the outcome is fixed. Sometimes the defendants would be sentenced to death by guillotining. So yes, guillotining became a key method that the regime used to execute political prisoners in the 1930s. So there were show trials. Roland Freisler would scream fanatically at those that were brought before him charged with political crimes. He would call them vile pigs and animals. Sometimes the defendants were made to stand there with trousers that were too loose with no belts, so that their trousers would keep falling down, which would humiliate the defendant. So they were not nice places to go. So if you were lucky, you would get a long stretch in a concentration camp. But a lot of people were sentenced to death by Roland Freisler. So the courts were another key component of the Nazi police state. You couldn't get a fair trial. The trial was rigged. You were simply there to be humiliated and screamed at, and oftentimes a death sentence pronounced, or if you were lucky, a long stretch in a concentration camp. Now, again, going back to the main method of control, as I've said, it's really the real power of the regime came through this network of civilian informants. Even the confessional in the Catholic Church was bugged by the Gestapo. So when you go in to confess your sins to a priest, that's supposed to be a sacred space, but not in Nazi Germany. The Gestapo were recording what people were saying, just in case they had committed some type of political offence. Now, another example of how the Nazis effectively got the people to police each other is through what is known as a denunciation. Now, a denunciation, as you can see there, it is when one citizen expresses concern to the authorities, to the police, to the Gestapo, that perhaps their neighbour, might be an opponent of the regime. Okay, so if someone, for example, refused to hang out a Nazi flag during a Nazi parade, or if they were seen to be grumbling about the regime, or anything that would perhaps arouse a suspicion of a neighbour, then you were encouraged to inform on your neighbour, and that was known as a denunciation. And one of the people that you could inform to was called a block leader. So most neighbourhoods had a block leader, someone who might even wear a Nazi uniform that was in charge of supervising a particular area of a neighbourhood. So very often people, perhaps even to increase their own prestige with the regime, would, tell on their neighbours, even if it was something minor, like, not hanging out a Nazi flag during a parade. That was enough to encourage neighbours to report on each other. Okay, so overall then, when you're any question that asks you about the Nazi police state, you are being asked effectively about how the Nazis used an apparatus of terror to keep the German people in line. So what you must talk about is the work of Heinrich Himmler and the SS network, which included the SD, the security services, the Gestapo, the secret police, control of the courts, and of course the policing of the labour camps and concentration camps. Okay, propaganda in indoctrination schools and education, that is the other side of the coin. So effectively the Nazis used two methods. They used a policy of terror through the police state, and through Goebbels they used a policy of propaganda to try and win hearts and minds. So any question in future that asks you about the police state, you must be talking about this apparatus of terror that would involve Himmler, the SS, Gestapo, the courts, and the concentration camps. The SS, of course, are they are at the center of this network of terror. The SS are the state security. They have different divisions, so the death head units of the SS policed and patrolled the concentration camps. The Waffen-SS were kind of like a paramilitary wing. They were armed. The SD was the security wing of the SS, and of course the Gestapo were the secret police attached to the SS. SS, think of state security, SS. So that is what you must talk about when you're asked any question about the Nazi police state. So what you might want to do is go back to that question. That question 5, explain how the Nazi police state affected the lives of the German people. We know that question is all about the concept of change. In what ways indicates that people's lives were affected in more than one way? So to do that question again, you would need to talk about how were people's lives affected by the Gestapo. So again, it creates that suspicion. People can't trust their own children, let alone their friend, because they could be an informant. You could talk about the courts and how people were not given a fair trial. We could talk about the threat of the concentration camps. So there's lots that you could explore in that question. So that, as part of your revision, as part of your mock targets, I think that's a good question to go back to and at least do a little plan. Okay, that's it for now.